It's great to be here. I'm Brian Lowery. I'm a organizational behavior professor at Stanford University, and my basic discipline is social psychology. And what I want to share with you all is a way of thinking about equity. So, diversity, equity, and belonging is the way you talk about it at Slack. And I want to provide some insight into work that I've done that sheds light on how we think about equity. So, when we think about equity, certainly from a psychological perspective, we generally think in terms of relative differences, right? So we think that companies or groups are fair or not, and that advantage and disadvantage typically describe the same thing, that is unfairness. So let me give a quick, let's see here, a picture to demonstrate what I mean. So in this case, if you think about this race, there is inequity here, right? So people aren't starting at the same place. And so this is often the way that people will talk about inequity, that everyone doesn't have the same opportunity to succeed because of where they start. And here, what you see is you could talk about the person who's closest to the finish line as being advantaged, or the person who's furthest away as being disadvantaged. But really, what you're describing is the whole situation here. You're describing something about this system, I would call it. Or you could think of this as an organization. Different people in the organization are in a place where it's easier for them to succeed or harder for them to succeed because of barriers they face, or where they've started from, or resources they've had. So the system itself, the company, the group, in this little case, this example, the race is unfair. And it's unfair because there are differences between people that affect their ability to succeed. And so this is how we typically talk about inequity, right? What's the difference between people? And I'm going to suggest, and research I've done, and I won't get into the particulars. If you're interested, you can go to my website and see it. But I have a lot of studies that provide evidence that this is not really the way that people think about inequity. This is not how people represent it. So really what people do is they think in terms of absolute differences. What does that mean? What it means is inequality is not is a feature of people and groups, not the system, not the company. So let me go forward here. Up, sorry, a little bit too far. So fairness in this way of thinking is about individuals having what they deserve. So when you look at the picture now, we have a starting line, and that changes how people think about what's going on in that race. So now, where before it was just an unfair company, unfair race, now you can point to different individuals in the situation and say they have too much or too little. So if you see the person is at the starting line, what that looks like is that person is where they should be. Now there's someone behind them, and that person is disadvantaged, and there's someone in front of that person, and that person, she might be advantaged, right? So now we can separate advantage and disadvantage and locate it in particular people, right? So in this case, so imagine that where there's a starting line, the person is at the starting line. Imagine there's only the person at the starting line and let's say the woman behind the starting line. If you wanted to fix that, the way you would fix it probably is by moving the woman behind up to the starting line, right? Because the person at the starting line is where they should be. Now imagine that you fixed it instead by moving the person at the starting line back. Now that person would feel like you've done them a disservice, you've treated them unfairly, even though they would recognize that the situation has become more equal. They still would feel like the way you've done that has created more unfairness in the system. And the reason this is important is because I think that the way that people think about inequity is with the starting line. And that starting line, and this is what's important, doesn't really exist. It's something we construct. It's an idea we create. So we decide what people should have, where people should be, and then we compare everyone to that, right? And that's what I mean by absolute differences. We have an idea of what is right, and then we compare everyone to that point of what is right. And if they're above that point, they're advantaged. If they're below that point, they're disadvantaged. Here's how this shows up in terms of race. So when we think about the context, the word white privilege, really what we're doing is saying white people have more than they should. White people are ahead of the starting line. Now, as a white person, that might not be your experience at all. You might feel like what's going on is you're at the starting line and you might recognize that Black folks or other people of color are behind the starting line and think that's not fair. But if you think that a remedy moves you back, you will also think that's unfair, even though that remedy reduces inequity. So the reason that it's important to understand how we think about inequity is it changes how we respond to attempts to rectify it. So if you believe that you have what you should, it's harder to accept a policy that seems to take something from you to help someone else, right? But it's important to keep in mind that the reality is that starting line is doesn't exist, right? That we're all truly in the situation on the left-hand side where there's just inequities among us, that the inequity exists in the system, and that if we want to create inequity, you have to find ways of giving everyone the same opportunities. And sometimes that means pushing people up, and sometimes that means pulling people back. And both those things are ways to produce more equity. So again, what I would say about this is it really shows up in the way we think about where we are. Where are we in the organization? What can we demand or expect of the organization? And what is our commitment to equity? And sometimes that commitment requires us to take a little bit less in service of a more just, a more equitable organization.